Marcus Thompson sat behind his large wooden desk in his chambers, rubbing his tired eyes as he finished reviewing the last case file of the day. The clock on his wall showed 7:30 p.m., much later than his usual departure time. At 52 years old, Judge Thompson had spent the last 2 decades building a reputation as one of the most fair-minded federal judges in the state. The evening had grown dark, and most of his colleagues had already left the courthouse. Only the cleaning staff and security guards remained, nodding respectfully as he walked through the marble halls. His footsteps echoed against the floor as he carried his worn leather briefcase, heavy with case files he planned to review over the weekend. The judge's day had been particularly challenging. He had presided over 3 difficult cases, including a sensitive civil rights violation that hit close to home. Growing up as a black child in the South during the 1970s, Marcus had faced his share of discrimination. Those experiences had shaped his commitment to justice and drove him to become a lawyer and eventually a federal judge. As he walked to his car in the reserved parking area, Marcus loosened his bow tie, a signature accessory he had worn every day since his father gave him his first one at law school graduation. The memory of his late father, who had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, brought a small smile to his face. "Always carry yourself with dignity, son," his father used to say. "Your excellence is your armor." The parking lot was almost empty, save for a few cars belonging to the evening staff. His black Mercedes S-Class, a reward he had given himself after his 10th year on the bench, sat under a flickering light. The car represented more than just luxury to Marcus. It was a symbol of how far he had come from the small 2-bedroom house where he grew up with his 4 siblings. Before starting his car, Marcus checked his phone. There were 3 missed calls from his wife, Sarah, a pediatrician at the local children's hospital. They had planned to have dinner together at their favorite restaurant to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary, but his last case had run longer than expected. He quickly sent her a text. "On my way home now, honey. Sorry for working late." The leather seats were comfortable against his back as he settled in for the 20-minute drive home. The radio played softly, classical music, his preferred choice for unwinding after a long day. The streets were relatively quiet, and the familiar route through downtown took him past buildings where he had argued cases as a young lawyer. As he drove, Marcus thought about the young black defendant he had seen in court that morning. The boy, only 19, reminded him of his own son, now a second-year law student at Harvard. The case had been a wake-up call about how much work still needed to be done in the justice system, even after all these years. Turning onto Maple Avenue, Marcus entered his neighborhood, an upscale area where he had lived for the past 15 years. The streetlights cast a warm glow on the large houses set back from the road. Children's bicycles and basketball hoops and driveways showed this was a family-friendly community. Here, Marcus had raised his 2 children, coached Little League baseball, and hosted countless barbecues for neighbors. The events that were about to unfold would shake not only his sense of security in this familiar place, but would also challenge everything he believed about progress in his community. As he adjusted his rearview mirror, Marcus noticed a police cruiser that had been following him for the last few blocks. He hadn't been speeding or breaking any traffic rules, but years of experience had taught him to be extra careful, regardless of his position. Little did Judge Marcus Thompson know that this routine drive home would become a turning point not just in his life, but in the ongoing conversation about racial profiling and police reform in America. The next few minutes would test his patience, his dignity, and his belief in the very system he had served for so many years. Officer James Barrett was 6 hours into his 12-hour shift when he first noticed the black Mercedes. At 34 years old, he had spent the last 12 years patrolling these same streets, convinced that expensive cars in this neighborhood needed extra attention. His fellow officers often praised him for having what they called a sixth sense about suspicious vehicles. The police cruiser's interior was quiet except for the soft crackle of the radio. Barrett adjusted his body camera, making sure it was turned off, a habit he had developed over the years when making what he called routine stops. His supervisor had warned him twice about his high number of traffic stops involving minority drivers, but Barrett always defended his actions as good police work. As he followed the Mercedes, Barrett noticed nothing illegal about the driving. The car maintained perfect speed, used turn signals properly, and stayed in its lane. Still, something about it bothered him. The windows were tinted, though legally so, and the car was too nice for this time of night, as he would later write in his report. Without warning, Barrett flipped on his patrol lights. The Mercedes responded perfectly, pulling over smoothly to the side of the road, using its turn signal and coming to a complete stop under a street light. This level of cooperation should have been a clear sign that the driver was familiar with proper procedure, but Barrett was already committed to his course of action. Before leaving his cruiser, Barrett radioed in the license plate and location. The dispatcher's voice crackled back with information that the vehicle was registered to a Marcus Thompson. There were no warnings, warrants, or flags on the registration. Barrett ignored this information, his hand resting on his holster as he approached the driver's side window. The interior light of the Mercedes was on, and Barrett could see a well-dressed black man sitting calmly with both hands visible on the steering wheel. Despite this textbook cooperative behavior, Barrett's approach remained aggressive. He stood slightly behind the driver's door, his right hand still near his weapon, and shined his flashlight directly into the car. "License and registration," Barrett demanded, not bothering with the usual police greeting. His voice carried the hard edge of authority he had perfected over years of traffic stops. The interior of the Mercedes smelled of expensive leather and subtle cologne, not the contraband Barrett had hoped to find. Judge Thompson reached slowly for his wallet, maintaining a calm that came from years of handling tense situations in his courtroom. "Officer, I want to be transparent with you. I'm reaching for my credentials. I'm Federal Judge Marcus Thompson," he said steadily, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to being listened to. Barrett's response was immediate and dismissive. "Sure you are. And I'm the president. Step out of the vehicle." His tone was mocking, and he took a step back, moving his hand to grip his holster more firmly. The streetlight above cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression appear even more threatening. Inside the car, Judge Thompson felt a familiar knot in his stomach, the same feeling he had experienced decades ago during his first encounter with law enforcement as a teenage boy. Despite his position, his achievements, and his age, he was suddenly reduced to what Officer Barrett saw: just another black man in an expensive car. "Officer, I'm going to comply, but I want to be clear that this stop appears to be without probable cause," Judge Thompson said, his judicial training kicking in as he documented the interaction verbally. He reached for his door handle with deliberate slowness. Barrett's partner, Officer Sarah Chen, had just arrived as backup. She stood near their patrol car, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Something about the driver's dignified manner and professional appearance made her uncomfortable with Barrett's aggressive approach. The next few moments would become crucial evidence in the investigation that would follow. As Judge Thompson stepped out of his Mercedes, still in his judicial robes, his court ID clearly visible on his chest, the power dynamic of the situation was about to shift dramatically. The security cameras from 3 nearby houses were silently recording every detail, capturing a scene that would soon make headlines across the country. What Officer Barrett didn't know was that his next actions would not only endanger his career, but would also spark a nationwide conversation about police reform and racial profiling. The routine traffic stop he had initiated was about to become anything but routine. The cool night air was tense with anticipation as Judge Thompson stood beside his Mercedes. His judicial robes caught the breeze, and the gold badge on his chest reflected the harsh beam of Officer Barrett's flashlight. Despite the situation, the judge maintained perfect posture, his hands clearly visible at his sides. Officer Barrett's face showed no change in expression when he saw the judicial robes. Instead, his skepticism seemed to increase. "Anyone can buy robes on the internet," he said loudly, circling Judge Thompson like a predator. "Put your hands on the hood of the car." Judge Thompson took a deep breath, remembering the talk he had given his own son about staying calm during police encounters. "Officer Barrett," he said, reading the name tag, "I'm going to comply, but I want to state again that I am Federal Judge Marcus Thompson. My courthouse ID is clearly visible, and you can easily verify my identity." Officer Chen, still standing near the patrol car, felt increasingly uneasy. She had seen Judge Thompson's photo in the local newspaper just last week after he had presided over a high-profile case. She opened her mouth to speak, but Barrett cut her off with a sharp hand gesture. "I said hands on the hood." Barrett's voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby residents. Lights began turning on in surrounding houses, and curious faces appeared in windows. Several people reached for their phones, sensing that something was wrong. With deliberate slowness, Judge Thompson placed his hands on the hood of his Mercedes. The cold metal against his palms reminded him of another time, 30 years ago, when he had faced similar treatment as a young law student. Back then, he had promised himself he would work to change the system from within. Barrett began a rough pat-down, checking the judge's pockets with unnecessary force. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, though they were less than 3 blocks from Judge Thompson's home of 15 years. "I live at 1242 Maple Avenue," Judge Thompson replied calmly. "I'm returning home from the federal courthouse downtown. Officer, I must insist that you contact your supervisor immediately." His voice carried the same authority he used in his courtroom, but Barrett seemed immune to it. More patrol cars were arriving now, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. The commotion had drawn a small crowd of neighbors, many of whom recognized Judge Thompson from community events and local charity work. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman from across the street, stepped onto her porch. "That's Judge Thompson," she called out. "He lives down the street. What are you doing to him?" Her voice carried the indignation of someone watching injustice unfold before their eyes. Barrett ignored the growing chorus of protests from observers. He pulled out his handcuffs, the metal catching the streetlight. "You're being detained for suspicious activity and failure to comply with an officer's commands." Just then, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Barrett, stand down immediately." It was Captain Roberts, Barrett's supervisor, who had been monitoring the radio traffic and recognized Judge Thompson's address when it was called in. The captain's arrival changed the atmosphere instantly. He rushed from his car, his face showing a mix of horror and embarrassment. "Judge Thompson, sir, I sincerely apologize for this incident." He turned to Barrett, his voice sharp with anger. "Officer Barrett, step away from Judge Thompson now." As Barrett reluctantly lowered his handcuffs, the true gravity of his actions began to sink in. Neighbors were recording everything on their phones, and Mrs. Peterson had already called the local news station. The story was spreading rapidly through social media, with initial posts already gathering thousands of shares. Judge Thompson straightened his robes, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had just endured. He looked directly at Captain Roberts, his voice steady and clear. "Captain, I want a full report of this incident on my desk tomorrow morning. Officer Barrett's body camera footage, the dispatch records, and all relevant documentation." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, and their murmurs of disbelief and anger created a background chorus to the scene. Several of Judge Thompson's colleagues from the federal courthouse were already being notified through a chain of text messages and calls. What had started as a routine traffic stop had transformed into a moment that would soon capture national attention. As Judge Thompson stood there, surrounded by police cars and concerned neighbors, he knew that this confrontation would become more than just another example of racial profiling. It would become a catalyst for change. The morning after the incident, Judge Marcus Thompson sat in his office, watching video clips of the previous night's events play across his computer screen. Local news stations were running the footage captured by neighbors' phones on a constant loop. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Sarah, his wife, had wanted him to take the day off, but Marcus knew staying home would send the wrong message. "I've never hidden from injustice before," he had told her over breakfast, straightening his bow tie. "I'm not about to start now." The security footage from neighboring houses told the story clearly. From 3 different angles, cameras had captured Officer Barrett's aggressive behavior, the gathering crowd, and Judge Thompson's dignified response. The videos had already reached millions of views on social media, with hashtags like #JudgeThompson and #PoliceLibius trending nationwide. In the police station across town, Officer Barrett sat in Chief Williams' office, his usual confidence replaced by nervous fidgeting. The chief, a veteran of 30 years on the force, played the security footage one more time, his face growing darker with each viewing. "What were you thinking, Barrett?" Chief Williams demanded, pausing the video at the moment Barrett reached for his handcuffs. A federal judge? In his own neighborhood? Wearing his robes? Each question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Barrett stared at the floor, his excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I was just following protocol, Chief." The car seemed suspicious. His voice trailed off as Chief Williams held up a hand to stop him. "Protocol?" The chief's voice was sharp. Show me where our protocol says to ignore valid ID, harass a respected member of the judiciary, and embarrass this entire department. He pushed a stack of papers across his desk. The press is having a field day. The mayor's office has called 3 times this morning. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Judge Thompson was meeting with his fellow judges. The conference room was packed, with every seat filled and more people standing along the walls. His colleagues, both black and white, shared similar stories of racial profiling, though few had experienced it while wearing judicial robes. Judge Sarah Martinez, one of Thompson's closest friends on the bench, spoke up. "Marcus, this is your moment. You have the power to make real change here. What do you want to do?" Thompson looked around the room, seeing the expectation in his colleagues' faces. He thought about Officer Barrett, about his own son in law school, about the countless other black men who faced similar situations without the protection of a judicial title. "I want to turn this into something positive," he said finally. "Not just another viral video, not just another angry headline. We have an opportunity here to create real change in police training and community relations." As he spoke, his clerk brought in the official police report from the incident. Thompson read it carefully, noting the discrepancies between Barrett's written account and the video evidence. But instead of anger, he felt a sense of purpose growing stronger. In another part of the city, Officer Sarah Chen sat in her apartment, writing a detailed statement about what she had witnessed. Her hands shook slightly as she typed, knowing her words would likely be used in the investigation. She had always prided herself on being a good cop, but staying silent now would make her part of the problem. Back in the courthouse parking lot, where the incident had begun, a group of community leaders gathered for an impromptu press conference. Reverend Jackson, a longtime civil rights activist, stood at the microphones. "What happened to Judge Thompson could have happened to any of us," he said. "The only difference is he has the power to make them listen." Judge Thompson watched the press conference on the small TV in his chambers, his mind already forming a plan. He picked up his phone and dialed Chief Williams' number. The conversation they were about to have would set in motion a series of events that would reshape police training not just in their city, but across the country. As the sun set on that crucial day, both Judge Thompson and Officer Barrett knew their lives had changed forever. But while Barrett faced the consequences of his actions, Thompson saw beyond punishment to possibility. The next steps would require wisdom, courage, and a commitment to justice that went beyond personal vindication. Within 48 hours of the incident, Judge Thompson's story had gone viral across the nation. Major news networks played the security footage on repeat, showing the moment when a respected federal judge, still in his robes, was forced to place his hands on his car by an overzealous officer. The police department's phones rang constantly. Reporters camped outside the station, hoping to catch a glimpse of Officer Barrett. Inside, the Internal Affairs Office worked overtime, reviewing not just this incident but Barrett's entire history of traffic stops. The numbers painted a disturbing picture. 80% of his stops involved minority drivers. Judge Thompson sat in his home office, reviewing hundreds of emails and messages from people sharing similar experiences. His son called from Harvard Law School, angry and worried. "Dad, you could have been killed," he said, his voice shaking. "Just like all the others we see on the news." "Son," Thompson replied, his voice steady, "this is exactly why I became a judge. Now we have a chance to make real change." He looked at the family photo on his desk, showing 3 generations of Thompson men at his son's high school graduation. His father hadn't lived to see him become a judge, but his words still guided him. "Don't just get angry, get smart." Meanwhile, Officer Chen's statement had reached the police chief's desk. Her detailed account described Barrett's history of targeting minority drivers and how other officers had noticed but stayed silent. Her courage in speaking up sparked something unexpected. 5 other officers came forward with similar observations. The mayor called an emergency meeting at City Hall. Present were Judge Thompson, Police Chief Williams, community leaders, and civil rights attorneys. The tension in the room was thick as they watched the compiled footage of the incident. "This stops now," the mayor declared, looking around the room. "Judge Thompson, what do you suggest we do?" Instead of calling for Officer Barrett's immediate firing, as many expected, Thompson pulled out a detailed proposal he had worked on for the past 2 days. "We need systematic change," he began, "not just punishment." His plan included mandatory bias training, community oversight committees, and a complete overhaul of traffic stop procedures. But what caught everyone's attention was his suggestion to create a program where officers would spend time in court, watching justice from the other side of the bench. Across town, Officer Barrett sat in his small apartment, watching his career crumble. His union representative had advised him to lay low, but the weight of his actions pressed heavily on his conscience. The viral videos showed him something he had refused to see in himself: clear bias in his actions. Social media exploded with the hashtag robes and rights as people shared their own stories of racial profiling. Civil rights organizations called for nationwide reform. Law enforcement agencies from other cities began reaching out to learn more about Judge Thompson's proposed changes. Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who had witnessed the incident, organized a community meeting in her backyard. Over 50 neighbors attended, including several police officers who lived in the area. The conversation was difficult but necessary, as people shared their experiences and fears. "I've lived here for 15 years," Judge Thompson told the gathering, "served this community, coached your children's baseball teams. Yet to Officer Barrett, I was just another suspicious black man in a nice car." The local police academy invited Judge Thompson to speak to their new recruits. Standing before them in his judicial robes, he commanded attention. "Your badge gives you power," he told them, "but with that power comes great responsibility. Tonight, I want to share with you what it feels like to be on the other side of that power." As evening fell on that fifth day since the incident, Judge Thompson received an unexpected letter. It was from Officer Barrett, requesting a meeting. The judge read the letter several times, noting the trembling handwriting and water stains that could have been tears. The next steps would be crucial. Thompson knew that how he handled this request would set the tone for everything that followed. As he sat in his study considering his response, his wife brought him a cup of coffee and asked, "What are you going to do?" He looked up at her and smiled slightly. "I'm going to do what a judge should do: listen to all sides and seek justice, not revenge." 1 week after the incident, Judge Thompson sat in his chambers preparing for an unusual meeting. He had agreed to meet Officer Barrett, not in his courtroom, but in the courthouse meditation room, a neutral space where victims often met with offenders in restorative justice cases. The small room was simply furnished with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Thompson arrived early, removing his judicial robes and placing them on a hook. Today, he chose to meet Barrett not as a judge, but as a man who had experienced something deeply personal. Officer Barrett entered precisely at the scheduled time, looking different without his uniform. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he sat down. The past week had aged him visibly. His suspension, the media attention, and the death threats had taken their toll. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Your Honor," Barrett began, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper, his resignation letter. "I wanted to give you this personally." Judge Thompson didn't take the letter. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair. "Before you resign, Officer Barrett, I want to tell you a story." He described his first experience with police profiling at age 16, then as a law student, and again as a young lawyer. "The only difference this time," he concluded, "was that I was wearing robes." Barrett listened, his face showing growing understanding as Thompson shared story after story. The judge then pulled out a thick folder. Complaints filed against Barrett over the years, each involving minority drivers. "Have you ever wondered why you make these choices?" Thompson asked gently. For the first time, Barrett broke down. He talked about growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, his father's prejudices, and his own unexamined biases. "I never thought of myself as racist," he said, wiping his eyes. "But watching that video, I couldn't recognize myself." Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, changes were already happening. Chief Williams had implemented the first phase of Thompson's reforms. Every traffic stop now required officers to announce their reason for stopping a vehicle before approaching it. Body cameras couldn't be turned off during any civilian interaction. Officer Chen had been promoted to lead a new training division focused on community relations and bias recognition. Her courage in speaking up had earned her respect from both fellow officers and community members. Back in the meditation room, Judge Thompson made an unexpected proposal. Instead of accepting Barrett's resignation, he suggested a different path. You can leave the force and this becomes just another viral video, he said, or you can be part of the solution. Thompson's plan was bold. Barrett would work with the community he had harmed, undergo intensive bias training, and share his story with other officers. Most importantly, he would join Thompson in speaking to police academies about their shared experience from both perspectives. Why would you give me this chance? Barrett asked, stunned by the offer. After what I did to you. Thompson smiled slightly. Because change doesn't happen by throwing people away. It happens when we face our mistakes and learn from them. He reached for his judicial robes. I wear these robes to represent justice, not vengeance. That evening, Thompson held a press conference announcing the new initiative. Standing beside him were Chief Williams, Officer Chen, and to everyone's surprise, Officer Barrett. The media buzzed with questions, but Thompson raised his hand for silence. What happened that night was wrong, he began, but our response to it will determine its true impact. Today, we're choosing education over punishment, understanding over anger, and progress over revenge. The announcement drew mixed reactions. Some activists criticized Thompson for being too lenient, while others praised his wisdom in turning a negative incident into an opportunity for real change. Back home that night, Thompson's wife found him in his study, looking at old family photos. "Do you think you made the right choice?" she asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. He pointed to a picture of his father at a civil rights march. "Dad always said that true change happens when we have the courage to face our enemies and help them become friends." He closed the photo album slowly. "Today, we took the first step toward that change." The story of the judge and the officer was about to enter a new chapter, one that would challenge both men to grow in ways they never expected. The real work of transformation was just beginning. 3 months after the incident, the police academy's largest classroom was packed with officers from across the state. They sat in silence as Officer James Barrett stood at the podium, his hands slightly shaking as he pressed play on the video of that fateful night. "That man in the video isn't who I wanted to be," Barrett began, his voice stronger than his trembling hands suggested. "But it's who I have become without even realizing it." Behind him sat Judge Thompson, watching as the officer he had once handcuffed now taught others about bias and redemption. The changes in the police department had been dramatic. Under the new Thompson Protocol, as it came to be known, traffic stop complaints had dropped by 60%. Every officer now wore an always-on body camera, and each traffic stop was reviewed randomly by a community oversight board. Officer Chen's training program had become a model for other departments. She stood at the back of the classroom, remembering how scared she had been to speak up that night. Now, her phone rang constantly with calls from other police departments wanting to learn about her methods. In his office, Chief Williams reviewed the latest statistics with Judge Thompson. The numbers told a story of real change, fewer complaints, improved community relations, and more diverse recruitment in the academy. "Your Honor," the chief said, "I never thought Barrett would become our best trainer on bias awareness." Thompson smiled, remembering the trembling man who had sat before him 3 months ago. "Sometimes," he replied, "those who have faced their own darkness become the best guides for others." He pulled out a letter from his briefcase, an invitation from the Justice Department to share their program nationally. Barrett's transformation had been remarkable. He spent his free time in the community he had once policed with suspicion, coaching youth basketball and attending neighborhood meetings. The same residents who had once demanded his firing now greeted him by name, seeing in him an example of genuine change. Mrs. Peterson hosted monthly community dialogues in her backyard, where officers and residents shared meals and stories. At one such gathering, a young black teenager asked Barrett, "How do we know you've really changed?" Barrett thought carefully before answering, "Because now I see people, not stereotypes. Judge Thompson taught me that justice works both ways. It punishes wrongs, but it also allows for growth." The boy nodded, understanding more than Barrett expected. The program's success attracted national attention. News crews interviewed Judge Thompson in his chambers, asking why he had chosen redemption over punishment. "Justice isn't just about enforcing laws," he explained. "It's about transforming lives." Officer Barrett's change has inspired others to examine their own biases. In the police academy, new recruits now spent their first week in Thompson's courtroom, watching justice from the other side of the bench. They attended community meetings and learned about the neighborhood's history before ever putting on a uniform. Barrett's old patrol car was now used for a different purpose, taking officers into neighborhoods for community service projects. The same vehicle that had once been used to profile residents now carried supplies for local food banks and after-school programs. One evening, as Thompson left the courthouse, he spotted Barrett helping an elderly black man change a flat tire. The officer didn't see the judge watching, didn't know anyone was looking. That's when Thompson knew the change was real. The police union, initially skeptical of the reforms, now proudly promoted the program. The Thompson-Barrett Initiative, as they called it, had reduced tension between officers and residents while making the job safer for everyone. In his weekly support group for officers, Barrett shared his ongoing journey. "Every day, I have to check my thoughts and actions," he admitted. "But now I understand that being a good cop means being a good human first." Judge Thompson's son, visiting from law school, attended one of Barrett's training sessions. Afterward, he told his father, "Dad, when you told me you were going to work with him, I thought you were crazy. But watching him today, I get it now." The city's mayor announced plans to expand the program to all public service departments. "What Judge Thompson and Officer Barrett have shown us," she declared, "is that real change is possible when we have the courage to face our mistakes and learn from them." As summer turned to fall, the changes continued to grow and spread. What had started as a tense confrontation on a dark street had blossomed into a movement for genuine understanding and transformation. The real victory wasn't just in changed policies, but in changed hearts. 1 year after the fateful traffic stop, Judge Marcus Thompson stood before a graduating class of police cadets. The auditorium was filled to capacity, with television cameras lining the back wall. Next to him stood Officer James Barrett, no longer the angry cop from that night, but a changed man with a powerful story to tell. "A year ago," Thompson began, his voice carrying across the silent room, "Officer Barrett and I met under very different circumstances." The audience shifted uncomfortably, knowing the viral video that had brought them to this moment. "Today, we stand before you as partners in change." The past year had brought remarkable transformations to the police department and the community. The Thompson-Barrett program had been adopted by 30 police departments across the country. Officers who once viewed community policing as a burden now shared stories of meaningful connections with residents. Barrett stepped up to the microphone, his badge gleaming under the lights. "When I stopped Judge Thompson that night, I was the kind of officer I now teach others not to be." He paused, looking at the fresh faces of the cadets. "But thanks to his wisdom, my mistake became a lesson instead of an ending." In the audience sat Officer Chen, now Captain Chen, heading the department's newly formed Community Relations Division. Under her leadership, civilian complaints had dropped by 70%. More importantly, officer satisfaction rates had risen as tension with the community decreased. Mrs. Peterson was there too, representing the Community Oversight Board. The elderly woman who had first called out Barrett's behavior now worked closely with him, showing other neighborhoods how to build trust between residents and police. After the ceremony, Thompson's son approached Barrett. The young law student had been skeptical of his father's decision to work with the officer. "I didn't believe people could really change," he admitted to Barrett. "You proved me wrong." The mayor presented Thompson and Barrett with the city's highest civilian honor, but their real reward came in the daily changes they witnessed. Traffic stops were now recorded and reviewed not just for problems, but for examples of excellent police work. Officers were recognized for building community relationships, not just making arrests. Local businesses that had once posted "No Cops" signs now offered free coffee to officers who took time to know their neighbors. The police station's walls, once covered with arrest statistics, now displayed photos of officers attending community events and helping residents. Thompson's judicial colleagues had initially questioned his approach, but the results spoke for themselves. Other judges across the country began implementing similar programs, recognizing that true justice sometimes meant creating opportunities for transformation. Barrett's fellow officers, who had once seen him as a disgrace to the force, now sought his advice on difficult situations. "The hardest part," he often told them, "is looking in the mirror and admitting your own biases, but it's also the most important part." The training program they developed together became required learning at police academies nationwide. It included not just bias recognition, but also history lessons about the communities officers served, cultural awareness training, and regular meetings with local residents. One evening, exactly 1 year after the incident, Thompson invited Barrett to his home for dinner. As they sat in the judge's study, surrounded by law books and family photos, Barrett noticed a framed picture on the wall. It was from that night, captured by a neighbor's security camera. "Why keep that photo?" Barrett asked, wincing at the image of himself confronting the judge. Thompson smiled. "To remind us that the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them." Their story became part of a larger movement, showing that meaningful change was possible when both sides were willing to work together. Police departments from as far away as Europe and Asia sent representatives to learn from their program. As the graduation ceremony ended, Thompson watched the new officers receiving their badges. Each one had spent time in his courtroom, in community meetings, and with Barrett, learning that effective policing required both courage and compassion. "What's next?" a reporter asked Thompson as he left the auditorium. The judge looked at Barrett, who was surrounded by cadets eager to learn from his experience. "We keep building bridges," Thompson replied. "One conversation, one person, one change at a time." The story of the judge and the officer had become more than just another viral video of police misconduct. It had become a blueprint for transformation, showing that even the deepest wounds could heal when treated with wisdom, courage, and the willingness to change.